Hello everyone, I'm Ixalan, and in this video we're going to look back at the cards that I was wrong about in my Ixalan full set limited review. Every time a new set comes out, I do a series of videos that week giving you my thoughts on every single card in the format and giving them grades that indicate how good I predict they will be in this new format. I make these videos before it is possible to play the format, so it is never possible to get everything right. With Rivals of Ixalan spoiler season right around the corner, and along with it another full set review, I thought this would be a good time to look back at my Ixalan limited review and talk about the cards that are either considerably better or worse than I thought they would be. The fact that we will still have a single pack of Ixalan in the next format makes it more worthwhile than usual to look back on the cards in this set, though it is worth noting that Rivals could shift the format enough that these grades don't hold water in the new format. One thing to note up front is that before actually playing the format, it wasn't super clear to me that this was going to be as fast of a format as it is. I don't think anybody really predicted that it would be. And because of this, auras and equipment were better than usual, along with small, efficient creatures. And most of the mistakes we're going to talk about on this list are because I overrated high-costed cards and underrated low-costed cards. Overall, though, I don't think I did too bad on Ixalan. Out of 284 cards, there are only 14 that I think I got wrong by more than half of a letter grade. That's only 5% of the set, and usually I end up missing on about 10%, so I didn't do too badly this time around. If you want to see what limited review I'm talking about, you can find a link to the playlist in the video below. Now let's get started with this video. First, let's start with Adanto Vanguard. I thought this seemed like a pretty good 2-drop, and I gave it a C+, meaning that it makes the cut the vast majority of the time in a white deck, but is really nothing special. However, Adanto Vanguard has proven to be a very powerful creature in the format, and I would argue it is just the best 2-drop in the format, in a format loaded with good 2-drops. It turns out that being able to attack forever, thanks to the fact that it can become indestructible, is pretty good. You can attack with it, and your opponent can be fearful that you have like a combat trick, even if you're attacking into like a 5/5, and they really have to think about whether or not it's worth blocking. And that's pretty great. Even without using a trick, your opponent has to have a creature with greater than 3 toughness to not lose a card for nothing. A lot has been made about the combination of Jade Guardian and an Aura. Auras go pretty well on the Vanguard too. While it doesn't have hexproof, Indestructible gets close enough. Overall, Adanto Vanguard is a firmly first pickable card in this format, and I would take as many copies of it as possible in 99% of white decks in this format. I've upped its grade from a C+ all the way to a B. You're pretty happy to first pick this card. Adanto Vanguard is not the only white card I got wrong, though. In fact, there are 3 of them. The second one is Bellowing Aegisaur. As a player, I really prefer slow, grindy formats, and I was thinking that's what this format might be, what with the dinosaur archetype, but I was wrong, obviously, and as a result, big dinosaurs like the Aegisaur here were just worse than I expected. I thought the Aegisaur would be first pickable and worth splashing in just about any deck. The fact it pumps your whole team every time it takes damage is awesome. It makes it difficult for your opponent to attack you, and it is difficult to block, too. But 6 mana is just too much in this format for most decks. Initially, I gave this a B-, indicating that I thought it would sometimes be first pickable, and should certainly be in most white decks. But its high mana cost and mediocre starting stats have me really down on it in this format, and for me it's dropped all the way to a C-. It is playable only in Dino Ramp decks, and those aren't successful super often in this format. The last white card we're going to revisit is Territorial Hammerskull. I noted in my initial review that this card would be great in aggressive decks, and I gave it a C+. Definitely a solid card, I thought. You'll play a lot of them in white decks. Well, it's better than that, and is one of the cards that can take an aggro deck in this format from merely being adequate to being incredible, and it doesn't hurt that just about every deck in this format is aggressive. So when I mentioned it was good in aggressive decks, I wasn't wrong. I just didn't realize all of the decks would like it. It finds its way into any deck running white, mainly vampires and dinosaurs, and it just doesn't matter. It'll find its way into any white deck. Territorial Hammerskull is in the argument for best common in the set, and is stupid good. It has moved all the way up to a B for me. It is first pickable over the majority of uncommons and even rares in this format. That does it for white. Now let's look at blue, where we will see my underrating the speed of the format continued to mess up my evaluations. First up, we have Dive Down. We have seen effects like this before be pretty mediocre, and as a result I gave Dive Down an F, arguing that it was only going to be good in very narrow situations, and that's not usually a card I want. Well, obviously since it's in this video, I was just wrong. It turns out that Dive Down is a great way to get tempo on your opponent. Removal in this format is few and far between, and that's what makes the aggro decks and the auras and the equipment so good, because much of the removal is awkward and clunky, and Dive Down trades for a removal spell while only costing 1 mana. This is usually a great trade, and there are lots of times when someone casts Dive Down to negate a removal spell that basically seals it for the person who used Dive Down to save this creature. And that's kind of what this format is. It's sometimes defined by a single play like Dive Down, or a successful combat trick. And Dive Down's one of those cards that can just sort of swing the game completely. So, obviously, Dive Down is not an F in this format. It goes great in aggressive Pirate and Merfolk decks, and while I don't think it's, incredible, it has moved from a card that I thought was unplayable to being a card that I basically want at least one of, maybe just one of. Getting it in multiples, it's still narrow enough that having it in multiples isn't great, but you want one of them in any blue deck that has a lot of creatures, and that means, to me, that it's moved all the way up to a C. The other blue card I got wrong was One with the Wind. If you've been watching my limited content for a while, you know that I normally dislike auras that don't give you some kind of value upon being cast. I like most of the cartouches, for example, because they gave you an immediate effect. That way, if your opponent kills the creature with the aura on it, you don't get completely blown out. As a result, purely offensive auras don't normally interest me, and I would only play them in the most aggressive of decks. Well, as I already mentioned, removal in this format is not so good, and there also happen to be common and uncommon creatures that are particularly good with auras. One of them is Adanto Vanguard, who we looked at earlier, and the other is Jade Guardian. All of that makes One with the Wind go from being a D. I thought it would be a card worth playing in the most aggressive of decks and be pretty solid there. But again, this format mostly is aggressive decks, and it belongs in basically any creature-heavy deck, which is 99.9% of the decks in this format. If your opponent doesn't kill your One with the Winded creature, you're just going to win the game. If they kill it, there's a good chance you lose, another indication of how swingy this format is, but most of the time it's just going to lead you to victory, especially if you put it on like a Vanguard or on a Jade Guardian, and it's moved all the way up to a C+ for me. I'm still not big on first picking this card. I know some people are, but I'm definitely willing to take it by 5th or 6th pick and be pretty happy about it. Next, let's move to black, where I was wrong on 3 cards. The first black card I want to take another look at is Anointed Deacon. When I looked at this card, it reminded me of medium cards from Magic's past, like Blister Stick Shaman. However, Anointed Deacon is excellent in this format, and it is one of the key cards for having a successful vampire deck. Between having common and uncommon flying vampires all over the place, and the ability to make vampire tokens that have lifelink, Anointed Deacon ends up pumping up key creatures and creating attacks that your opponent just can't block profitably. While 5 mana is a lot in this format, the fact that it immediately impacts the board by pumping a creature when you go to combat helps mitigate against some of that. In my review, I gave it a D in a deck that doesn't get there on vampires, and I do still think that's correct. I don't think I'm wrong there. You don't want to run this in a deck without a lot of vampires, but I gave it a C in a vampire deck, and now I would say it's a B- in a vampire deck. This is sort of the card that if you see it pick 4 or 5, vampires are pretty open, and you should snag it immediately. Next, we have a card that I overrated, and I think the only rare on this video, and that is Arguel's Bloodfast, which transforms, of course, into Temple of Aklazatz. Normally, a card like Bloodfast would be pretty solid. Drawing cards for a couple mana and life is a pretty great way to spend your mana in life. It can even flip when you need it to if you are in danger of dying. However, this format is just too fast for most mana sinks, and dumping mana and life into Arguel's Bloodfast in the early game, instead of building up your board, means you're probably going to die. You have to be playing creatures early in this format or you're dead. It is still a pretty great card in longer games when those do happen, but there aren't a lot of those in this format. The first time around I gave it a B-, even claiming that it was worth first picking sometimes, and I was just flat wrong. I think this is the biggest difference in grade of any card on this video. I think it's a D now. You don't want to play it against most decks. It's actually more of a sideboard card in most cases. Next we have Mark of the Vampire, and that's the last black card I think I got wrong. And it's another aura. Basically, the 3 common auras are all on this list. In most formats, this card would be a D- or an F. We've seen cards like it before, and nobody thought they were good, including myself. It just costs too much mana for the stats boost it gives. However, in this format, where removal is at an even higher premium than normal, and is a format that's pretty much defined by racing, both the stat boost and the lifelink is very powerful, as putting this on one of your guys makes it very difficult for your opponent to win a race. As mentioned earlier, it is the most disgusting when you put it on Adanto Vanguard, which gives you a 5/3 with lifelink that allows you to pay 4 life to make it indestructible. That's an insane engine, and you're just going to win the game. This is even more potent in the format than Jade Guardian and One with the Wind is, which is sort of the one people really reference a lot, but they're both very potent combos. This is a solid playable in basically any black deck, and instead of the F I gave it initially, I think it's a C. Now let's move to red, where I was wrong about 2 cards. First, there's Ryle. I really wanted this card to be good, and for the Enraged deck to consistently actually be a thing. You can see that between my overrating both Ryle and Bellowing Aegisaur, but that deck doesn't often come together, and even when it does, you'd rather just be running more creatures than Ryle. It just doesn't do enough in most situations to warrant playing in your deck. I gave it a C plus in dinosaur decks in my set review, which is pretty insane because it is actually just an F in all decks. Don't play this, and I apologize to those of you who decided to because of my review. Next, we have the last aura that I was wrong about, and that is Swashbuckling. This is another aura I gave an F, which was probably overly harsh for any format in retrospect. I mean, it gives a decent stat boost and haste for a fairly efficient cost. It's probably more like a D in most formats, as the most aggressive decks around would be interested in playing this. But in this format, where auras are good for reasons I've already mentioned numerous times in this video, this is a solid playable, and I give it a C now. Let's move to green, another color where I made 2 mistakes. First up, I overrated Blossom Dryad. My brain was probably addled by drafting tons of fun ramp decks and Hour of Devastation drafts when I did this set review because I gave this thing a B-, which seems insane. It's a little bit high for most formats, though I do really like ramping and this helps with that. But this format punishes decks that are trying to ramp in most cases, and playing an inefficient creature like Blossom Dryad is a really dangerous way to start your turn 3. And for me, it's dropped all the way down to a C. It's not a huge drop, but it goes from it being potentially first pickable, which I think was a pretty insane prediction of mine, to being, filler, being a fine green card you'll play one of in a lot of decks. And it does get to be good in the rare occasions where you're actually able to put together a ramp deck. You're running like Star of Extinction and a bunch of big scary dinosaurs. But most decks just don't have that going on, and most of them, it's just going to be a C. Blossom Dryad isn't the only green card that I overrated, though. I did the same with Snapping Sailback. I can forgive myself more for this one, as this card would be legitimately first pickable and incredible in basically every format. But it isn't here. It's just too clunky and awkward. This format is loaded with combat tricks that can just kill this dude and keep their guy alive, not to mention really efficient bounce spells that also make him look silly. That said, he isn't a bad or unplayable card, but I gave him a B in my initial review, meaning he was first pickable in the majority of packs. He's dropped all the way down to a C plus for me. Which again isn't terrible. I would play him in most green decks. I'm just saying he's not quite as powerful as I thought, and he's been a bit of a disappointment. I was also wrong about one artifact in the set, and that's the last card we're going to look at. And that card is Pirate's Cutlass. I didn't think this card was terrible, but I gave it a D in non-pirate decks and a C plus in pirate decks. I just thought the cost of playing and equipping it was too high in a deck without pirates in it, but it turns out that Cutlass is good in basically all of the non-dinosaur tribes, and even there it isn't terrible. It is probably as good in vampires, or at least almost as good in vampires, as it is in pirates, since there are so many evasive vampires and lifelink vampires. And again, lifelink is an incredible keyword in this format because it makes it very difficult for your opponent to win a race. This card is good for the same reason auras are in this format. Not a lot of removal in this format, and there aren't a lot of creatures that can profitably block a Pirate's Cutlass creature in this format. Creatures wielding the Cutlass can just go completely insane and win you the game. Now it is a card I feel fine about first picking, and I'm willing to move it all the way up to B- now, noting that it is a little worse in dinosaurs than the other 3 tribes, and a little better in the pirate deck. Well, that does it for this video. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so others can enjoy it too. In the comments, let me know which of these mistakes I made you think is the biggest. And if you want to catch a lot more MTG Limited content, including 2 draft videos and a crack-a-pack every single week, not to mention full set limited reviews, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching.